Last speaker this afternoon is Emily Neumeier. Emily is a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania who enviably is residing in Turkey in this year, doing research on the architectural patronage of provincial Ottoman notables in the 18th century. And I did think, as I read your biography, Emily, how many of these might have been women? Please.
Well, I'd like to join my colleagues today in thanking the organizers for hosting us here, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Today I would like to examine the ways in which the mid-20th century Turkish artist Cemal Tollu appropriated and synthesized diverse and often seemingly incongruous artistic traditions as he sought to meet the demands for a national art form. The Liberation of Manisa, a canvas that can be tentatively dated to the latter part of Tollu's career in the early 1960s, serves as my primary case study. As an Anatolian landscape layered with allusions to ancient civilizations, as well as the masters of post-impressionism, this work acts as an ideal point of reference for understanding the paradox of forging an artistic tradition that was both distinctively situated within national borders while looking beyond to Europe. The setting of the Liberation of Manisa is a medium-sized town located in the southwest of Turkey, lying in a forested valley next to the foothills of Mont Sainte-Victoire. During the Turkish War of Independence, the Greek army seized Manisa, and the scene in Tollu's painting most likely refers to September 8, 1922, when the Turkish resistance forces recaptured the city. As Tollu himself served in the Independence War as a cavalryman along the Western Front, he almost certainly witnessed this event himself. In the foreground of the painting, soldiers have arrived to bring relief to the devastated townspeople, evidenced by the nude corpse of a young woman lying next to her infant, with the smoking remains of the city and Mount Sainte-Victoire in the distance. By choosing to depict the moment of deliverance after the disaster, Tollu also affirms the role of the soldier savior figure in the formation of the new republic. While Tollu's painting depicts a very specific moment in Turkey's history, it also incorporates stylistic references to an astonishingly diverse range of sources. First, the arrangement of the figures in the foreground, as well as the painting's subject matter, cite Delacroix's Massacres at Chios of 1824. This is not a simple act of appropriation. In the Liberation of Manisa, Tollu has cleverly inverted the scenario of the Delacroix, with the Turks now the victims of terror inflicted by Greek soldiers. Additionally, Tollu's use of unmodulated blocks of color and the immediacy and boldness of his brushstrokes look to the work of Matisse as well as German Expressionism. But perhaps the most evident model is Paul Cézanne. The silhouette of the mountain ridge in the Liberation of Manisa mirrors Cézanne's numerous views of Mont Sainte-Victoire, and Tollu's stratigraphic composition and avoidance of long orthogonal lines, effectively flattening the picture plane and reducing spatial depth, is an organizing structure characteristic of Cézanne's landscapes. In short, the Liberation of Manisa is a Fauvist interpretation of a Cézannian landscape and Delacroix-esque themes reinscribed as markers of a distinctively Turkish past. I believe that it is crucial to highlight the complexity of this work because Tollu does not attempt to suppress the citational nature of the painting. The mountain is clearly Mount Sainte-Victoire, but it also never ceases to be Mont Sainte-Victoire. It is the paradoxical notion of the Anatolian Mont Sainte-Victoire that lies at the center of this project. Tollu's overt and bold use of citation, as well as his particular reverence for Cézanne, are by no means idiosyncratic, but rather a feature of Turkish painters from the Republican period. To understand how the issues of influence and citation in art were negotiated within this milieu, we can turn to the words of Tollu himself, as published in the Istanbul newspaper Yeni Sabah. Tollu served as a weekly columnist in the 1950s, contributing over 300 articles in total, an important untapped resource for the study of Turkish modernist painting. A critical analysis of the Liberation of Manisa, supplemented with the artist's own reflections on art making, offers a unique opportunity to witness the development of a national aesthetic. Before Tollu and his contemporaries began to create a Turkish national art, they studied Western European painting at its source. In the 1920s, the Turkish government sent young art students like Tollu to Europe to learn the latest trends in painting and sculpture. The young artist arrived in Paris in 1928, where he primarily studied in the ateliers of Montparnasse with the painter and theoretician André Lotte, who had come to deeply inform Tollu's own philosophy of painting. Lotte championed Cubism, favoring the post-World War I phase that moved back from extreme fragmentation and sought a return to order. Similar to Braque and Picasso, Lotte emulated the landscapes of Cézanne while elaborating on the artist's ideas about distortion in geometric forms. Upon the return of Tollu and his colleagues to Istanbul in the early 1930s, these young artists set to work forging a new language for Turkish painting in the theories and modalities of Cubism, with Cézanne held to be the progenitor of the movement. Supported by the government, these painters showed their work in state-sponsored exhibitions and formed artist groups, the most influential from this period being the so-called D group, of which Tollu was a founding member. By the late 1930s, Turkish artists began to concentrate on more nationalist and socialist themes, particularly provincial Anatolian life, an example of which you can see here. The current art historical narrative tends to characterize this period in Turkish art as one in which painters moved away from their foreign training and immersed themselves within a rural context, but the Liberation of Manisa demonstrates that the shift in emphasis to Anatolian landscapes and figures did not ipso facto result in the abandonment of French or German models. On the contrary, the reception of Cézanne and the depiction of pastoral themes are by no means mutually exclusive in Turkish modernist painting. Tollu's writings reveal an internal debate within the Turkish art community over how readily Cézanne and other European painters were to be received. In Yeni Sabah, Tollu adopts a defensive stance concerning his reliance on French sources. In an article entitled "Being Original and Unique," he writes in direct response to critiques lodged against him by a younger generation of Turkish artists who embraced abstract expressionism. Tollu denounces the tendency of these new artists to boast about their originality and individuality, cautioning his students not to be seduced by the false idols of liveliness, freedom, and imagination, because, he argues, more often than not, freedom in art does not come from genius, but ignorance. He advises them, rather, to rely on the rules of art to be learned from the great artists like Cézanne, Matisse, or Picasso. It is clear that, for Tollu, studying and citing the master artists of the past goes far beyond pragmatic borrowing. Studying great works of art is a rite of passage, and connecting oneself to artists like Cézanne or Delacroix boasts a painter's training and authoritative knowledge of art history. Throughout his own career, Tollu never shied away from indicating his sources of inspiration. For example, in one of his early works, The Young Dancer of 1935, he goes so far as to include the original model in the painting itself, depicting a young ballerina standing against a wall with a work by Degas hanging behind her. Tollu also argues that the act of citation, rather than diminishing the individuality of an artist, in fact serves as an indicator of the authorial presence. In an article titled "Influence in Artworks," Tollu once again responds to young artists who charge the older generation with copying foreign artworks. As for the works under question resembling the works of Delacroix or Moreau, this cannot be considered copying, because in both paintings there is a separate value in terms of showing the artist's interpretation of color and design, the possibilities of realization, and the personalities of our friends signing their works, along with the benefit from the aforementioned French masters in terms of composition. Many examples from art history are shown to us in this vein. In this passage, Tollu posits that every work is inherently imbued with traces of the personality of its artist, even if there is abundant citation of external models. So, while the accusation of copying implies a certain passivity, Tollu suggests that the virtuosic blending of disparate elements in the Liberation of Manisa delivers the agency back to the artist, who knowledgeably edits and selects visual references from a vast repertoire of knowledge. Among the various sources of inspiration in his painting, Tollu gives pride of place to Cézanne as he frames the canvas around the mountain, the mirror image of Mont Sainte-Victoire. Tollu held Cézanne to be the father of modern art, stating in his article Beyond Cézanne that, quote, even after his death, his admirers increase and his influence upon artists continues until this day. Cubism and Fauvism certainly began with him. The new art finds its roots in Cézanne, end quote. Tollu's emotional connection with the French master painter is evident, to the point that he attempted to position himself as the rightful inheritor of Cézanne's teachings. In the article, 50 years after Cézanne's death, Tollu begins with a vignette of the old master painter as a spurned patriot who, quote, faced the various insults of children while leaving to paint or returning home exhausted and, after all of this, still wanted to give his works to the Provincial Museum, end quote. Tollu goes on to criticize the contemporary population of Aix, who on the 50th anniversary of Cézanne's death organized various memorials in his honor, sparing nothing in this aim to pay penance for sins formerly committed. Tollu thus mocks the people of Provence who rejected the master painter and only too late tried to make amends for their misunderstanding. Solving the double bind between Cézanne's rootedness in the French countryside and Tollu's claim on him for the Turkish people, he strips the citizens of Aix of the right to declare Cézanne as one of their own, and by implication relocates the true Cézanne reception in Turkey. The role of Cézanne within Tollu's project of defining a Turkish artistic identity can be situated within the wider nationalist rhetoric that rooted modernity in rural values, traditions, and geography. This emphasis on the Anatolian countryside was a rather recent development in popular imagination. For almost 500 years, the Ottoman elite centered in Istanbul viewed the provinces of Anatolia as a cultural backwater. After the loss of the former Ottoman territories and the move of the new Republican government to Ankara, however, people were forced to reorient themselves and rethink Anatolia as the core of their homeland. As a result, an emphasis on provincial topography, as seen in the Liberation of Manisa, became a crucial component for Turkish painting beginning in the 1930s. This transition can be clearly observed in Tollu's 1940 work, From Istanbul to Ankara, in which the ancient citadel of Ankara, bathed in a golden halo of light and capped by the new Turkish flag, rises above the gloomy Bosphorus landscape in Istanbul. This painting serves as a vivid allegory of the transition in the national consciousness from the old to the new. In the art of this period, the citadel in Ankara becomes a trope for modernity, and in the majority of Tollu's provincial landscapes, the ubiquitous mountain looks not only to Mont Sainte-Victoire, but also to Ankara, with the references working like geological layers collapsing into one another. Through government-sponsored initiatives of modernization that brought radio towers, tractors, and railroads to the farthest reaches of Turkey, the provinces were rapidly acculturated to reforms emanating from the center. But at the same time, cultural engineers in Ankara and Istanbul were paradoxically attempting to locate the Turkish national identity in the very pastoral experience that was being eradicated. The task of recovering this myth of the folk lay squarely upon artists such as Tollu. In 1938, the government initiated a 6-year program of province tours that sent 10 artists every year to every geographic region in Turkey with the objective of capturing the village life of Anatolia. Tollu participated in this initiative twice. The point of these trips was not to scientifically document these landscapes. What painting offered as a medium was its ability to reify the ineffable spirit of the Turkish people through the visualization of its people and topography. And in this task, Cézanne proved to be a font of inspiration, especially in terms of the motifs and framing techniques found in the artist's passages from Provence. One of Tollu's paintings from this province tour period that heavily borrows from Cézanne's landscapes is a view of the city of Bursa, painted in the mid-1940s, copied later in the 1960s. Tollu's appropriation of Cézanne's compositional tactics are quite evident, cutting off the foreground with a wide horizontal strip set at a slant and framing the canvas with 2 plane trees standing sentinel on either side. Tollu may have paid special attention to Cézanne's landscapes because they were similarly rooted in a specific provincial setting as opposed to the hustle of Parisian life. This characterization of Cézanne as the antithesis or solution to the vicissitudes of urban living found its potency in Europe during the interwar years, and it is reflected in Tollu's praise of Cézanne's ability to capture the, quote, spirit of his province's people, their philosophy, melancholy, austerity, and intelligence, end quote. By setting out to paint Anatolian landscapes, Tollu and his peers took on the same goal. In the Liberation of Manisa, which the artist and art historian Adnan Çoker has described as an Anatolian epic, Tollu endows a majestic quality to the setting, giving just as much visual prominence to the landscape as he does to the figures at the bottom of the canvas. Tollu's focus on geography does not alienate the figures from their land. Rather, he suggests their profound connection. The local population in the foreground formally relate to their environment. For example, the mountain is in dialogue with the nude body directly below it, as they both feature jutting curves defined by a thick contour line and are cut off abruptly on the left side, in the case of the mountain by the trail of white smoke, and the body by the pile of white cloth. Tollu also unites the figures in their land literally by dissolving and blending the geographic and human forms into one another. For example, the head of the horseman to the far left, which is here, melts into the brown tree trunk to the point that the viewer is hard-pressed to know where one element ends and the other begins. It almost seems as if the tree sprouts from the soldier's torso. Another instance of this effect can be seen in the embracing figure standing to the right, here, where the head of the man facing the viewer is a light green, the same color as the monuments of the city directly behind him. In the semiotic slippage of color, Tollu models himself on Cézanne's dramatic fusing of nature and human bodies, a noted feature in his bather scenes. Cézanne often melts and merges the nude figures into each other, as well as their surrounding environment, as can be seen in the large bathers of 1906. These moments of ambiguity in Cézanne's work can often be quite unsettling for a viewer, but when Tollu relocates this approach in a Turkish context, the effect acquires a more positive valence. In the Liberation of Manisa, this joining of bodies is more of a gesture to the relationship with the people and their land and each other, as inscribing the body politic onto a laic geography was a primary concern for the nationalist project. There were also attempts in this discourse to link, along pseudoscientific lines, the people of Turkey to Anatolia's pre-Islamic civilizations, effectively defeating the competing Ottoman tradition by erasing it from history. One of the direct consequences of this project was the launch of several excavations of Hittite sites throughout central Anatolia and the establishment in 1921 of the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations in Ankara, where Tollu worked as a director beginning in 1935. His contact with the ancient archaeological material made a deep impression. In an article titled Museum of Hittite Art, Tollu wrote that the, quote, plastic quality of ancient Anatolia, end quote, could be observed from the most ordinary pot or the grandest frieze. Tollu's interest in the Hittites is abundantly evident in other canvases such as the Hittite storm god, which you can see here. And the way many of the figures in the Liberation of Manisa stand in profile and are arranged in a frieze-like row across the bottom of the canvas also point to Tollu's interest in Hittite relief sculpture. Cézanne similarly participated in a nationalist rhetoric that stressed the importance of archaeological materials and their connection in an imagined line of unbroken continuity to artisanal crafts uncorrupted by industrialization. Within his own writings, Tollu argues the same case, suggesting that Turkish painters could benefit just as much from visiting the Archaeology and the Ethnography Museum as they could in the galleries of Paris. In this way, Tollu was able to relocate the features of modern art that he admired most, strict formalism and sculptural solidity, into the art of the Hittites in contemporary Turkish villages. By situating these formal values in an indigenous Turkish context, Tollu and his colleagues argued for a modern aesthetic that was latent within their own geography. To conclude, I argue that in the Liberation of Manisa, Tollu was not just responding to a specific historical event. He was engaged in the act of history-making itself. The 1950s and early 1960s was a time when the myth of Kemalism was being solidified for both internal and international consumption, as Turkey was fashioning itself as the bulwark of democracy against the Soviet threat. And in this self-fashioning, the fine arts served as a public arena where painters negotiated questions of forming a national identity. In his characterization of the art of Tollu, the painter and art historian Nurullah Burke made the argument that it was with Lot, Leger, and Neumeier that Cemal Tollu attained a true sense of artistic nationality. The claim that an artist can discover his national and individual personality, not in his home country but abroad, is a difficult proposition. But I suggest that it is precisely by locating and putting pressure on these unstable fissures, where Turkish painters learn how to be Turkish in Paris, and the mountains of Provence stand witness to the destruction and deliverance of an Anatolian town, that we can begin to understand the fundamentally complex and ambiguous nature of nation building itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, as well, for sticking to time, and I have to apologize for omitting the title of your paper, but it was so very clear that you were talking about an Anatolian Mont Sainte-Victoire that I hope that nobody was in any doubt. This is looking widely, and I don't look at this material, so I am perfectly convinced by Emily's argument, but there must be other comments, and so I invite questions because we are well within time. Please go to the mic if you have one. Sheila.
Well, as you can imagine, I am not an unbiased witness, but I think that was a very nicely presented and extremely well illustrated paper. I'd like to shift gears a little bit, perhaps, and move from production to reception and from artist to painting, and ask what happened afterwards. What was the market for whom this kind of art was made, and what happened to this particular painting until the present?
Thank you for that question. Okay. Thank you for that question. This painting is in the painting and sculpture museum in Istanbul, and it made it into the museum this is one of the last paintings that Tollu did before he died in 1966, and we know that it came into the collection in the late 1960s, so it was made pretty soon. It entered the collection pretty soon after it was made. In terms of who was the intended audience for these paintings, I think it's safe to say that these paintings were intended for a museum, a state museum space. Tollu, in an article that he wrote in the 1950s, said that in an article entitled "The War of Independence and Our Artists," said that there needed to be the establishment of a War of Independence museum, and that artists who had witnessed the events of the War of Independence had an obligation to paint their memories of the event. And I think that this is clearly, part of his own effort of doing just that.
And
thank you, Emily. I thought that was a great paper. I really enjoyed it. And how fabulous that you have all this material written by the artist to consult. That's just incredible. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. So did he write about the generations of Ottoman artists who preceded him, who'd gone to Paris to find their Turkish identity as painters? I mean, what did he have to say about those late 19th and earlier 20th century Turkish artists?
Thank you for your question. He absolutely did discuss the previous generations who had also gone, such as like Osman Hamdi Bey, and then there was a second wave of so-called Impressionist painters, so like Ibrahim Çağla and people like that. And a lot of his articles take on the tone of really just straight educational art history articles. So I mean, a lot of the times it's just sort of giving the background in a very positive valence. But one aspect of it that's interesting that I saw in the articles is that specifically dealing with his earlier generation, with his teachers, the ones who went off right before World War I, that came back painting as impressionists, like Hikmet Onat, he actually criticized them, and he wanted to separate himself from them and he wanted to separate Cézanne from those painters, right? Because they were looking at Cézanne too, but they came with the impressionist Cézanne, and he showed up with the cubist Cézanne. And in these articles, you kind of see this back and forth within the Turkish milieu that's really interesting. So he actually says something like, well, Cézanne was actually an impressionist, but, later on he decided he didn't want to play games of color anymore. And he wanted to look at the, geometrical solidity. And so it was this kind of language where he was actually giving art history, but it was very much tinged with this, like, internal ideological discourse within Turkey itself. That's really interesting.
Fabulous subject. Thank you so much.
No further questions? Not even a comment from some of the Turks among us? Sheila? So no more questions. Then let me have a few concluding words, if I may, because I think with this paper, sorry, will I be heard this way? With this paper, we have really gone and looked very widely as opposed to the last 5 papers of this session. I would simply like to say that speaking as an interpreter of painting whose approach was shaped within this very building by its first curator of Islamic art, I'm really struck by how our field has moved along the path in more decades than I perhaps care to acknowledge. I think, however, that every single one of us, every single one of the speakers of the last, not just this session, but the prior one, would agree that it is really still incumbent upon us to continue to look closely at what lies on the surface or surrounds it, or has been written about it when we are lucky enough to have contemporary sources, as well as then to raise our heads, draw back, and look more widely at the place and the function and the meaning of these images within their context. Please then join me in thanking all of the speakers of this session.